All right, so I think we're ready to get going again. Sorry about those difficulties, everybody. So as I was saying, um, the field crew that's out here working with me and myself are living out of a really rustic field camp out on the island. We all have our own tent platforms and your basic camping tents that we're living out of for the entire summer. I first got out here in the beginning of May, and I plan on staying out on the island until the middle of September, so well after our puffins leave and most other seabirds as well. Um, so we're conducting a lot of different research out on the island, and it's really important research. And I'm going to go over some of that stuff that we're working on right now. So some of the research that we're working on is some diet studies. We're just about to start getting ready with that once our chicks start hatching, which is going on right now for the terns. And we're just about to start with puffins hatching, probably within the next week, which is really exciting. So with the diet studies, what we're basically doing is we're sitting in bird blinds and we're watching the fish that the parents are carrying in and then delivering their chicks. And we do this for both puffins and both species of terns that I mentioned. So again, the common and Arctic terns. So that's one of our biggest studies that we have going on. In addition to identifying the prey species that we see the parents bringing in, we also try to calculate the feeding rate. So how many feedings a day are puffin chicks getting? And what we do for that is we sit in a bird blind and we take turns amongst all the people that are on the field crew. And we start before dawn and we end watching a certain number of burrows until after dusk. So there's a lot of time in bird blinds where we're watching these birds and learning more about them. Some of the other things that we do is we keep track of chick growth. So we're out there almost every day or every other day measuring the wing chord of the chick to see how quickly their wing is growing and to track their weight. And while we do this, we put metal bands on their legs that are very lightweight, either made out of stainless steel or aluminum. And these bands all have individualized numbers that identify that specific bird and no other bird that gets one of these metal bands. So those bands are being put on the chicks as they hatch, and we can keep track of them until they fledge and they leave their nest, and once they come back and start nesting. Those bands are also really special because they allow us to keep track of birds, for example, that were from the Puffin Cams themselves. If we didn't have these bands, we wouldn't know which puffin was which. And now we're able to start seeing puffins come back, such as Pal, one of our puffin chicks from back in 2014 that was in the burrow camp. So the field crew right now, as I mentioned, is out there banding terns, and soon enough we'll be banding puffins. Some of the other work that we do is we count the number of nests that are on the island, and we do this for a whole bunch of different species. We do it for essentially all of the breeding species on the island, actually. So as I was mentioning earlier, we just conducted our tern census, which is basically just like a census of people, but we're walking across the island in a standardized fashion to get all the nests that we can. And as I was saying, we counted over 2,000 tern nests this year, about 1,200 common terns, and about 830 or so Arctic terns. We'll also be doing this for puffins, and the puffin numbers last year were in the mid 500s for the number of pairs on the island. And I think this year we're going to be a bit higher. It seems like there's a lot of puffins around, there's a lot of occupied burrows from what we're looking at, but we won't have the final numbers on the numbers of puffins until probably the end of July or the beginning of August. And we can certainly report on that either in a future live chat or on a blog post. But it's really exciting to see this puffin colony grow. So we also do those censuses with the puffins, the terns, and we also do it with two different species of cormorants. The cormorants we count from a boat, actually. We have some folks that come out here and deliver our food every 2 weeks, and when they come out, we have the opportunity to get a boat ride with them, and we go to the other end of the island, which is difficult to see from land, and we count the number of cormorants that are nesting. They're very easily disturbed, and we don't like to disturb them, but if we're on the water on a boat, we can get really good counts of them. So the most common cormorant that we have in the United States and that you might see on a pond or by the ocean or something like that is the double-crested cormorant. But on Seal Island, we have another cormorant called the great cormorant, which is very unusual. And in the United States, they really only breed in Penobscot Bay, which is where Seal Island is, in mid-coast Maine. And there's only a little over 40 pairs. And this year we have 33 of those 40 pairs breeding on Seal Island. So in the entire United States, the great cormorant only has around 40 pairs, and almost all of them are on Seal Island. So this is an extremely important nesting habitat for those birds. They're very rare for breeders in the United States. However, in the winter, we do get birds that come down from Canada and from Newfoundland that are wintering along the United States northeastern coast. So that's a very special bird that we have here on Seal Island, and we're very happy that it's nesting and that we're seeing those numbers going up. But one of the reasons that we are on this island is to protect those birds, and if we see predators such as bald eagles coming in, we deter them by scaring them off the island so they don't come back. And eventually those eagles and other predators associate us being on this island, and it's not a comfortable place for them to come. So that's one of the jobs that we have here. And the last study that I'm going to talk about is one that some of you folks are helping with, which is great, which is called reciting the bands that I was mentioning before. And what that reciting means is we're basically reading those individualized numbers from a bird blind with either binoculars or a telescope, or with cameras sometimes. And we're able to read those band numbers of the individualized birds, and we can keep track of them through time, where they're nesting, who they're mating with, and how they're moving between islands. So we have, on Project Puffin, we manage 7 different seabird colonies, 3 of which have nesting puffins. Matinicus Rock and Eastern Egg Rock are the 2 other islands, and we're able to see how those birds are moving between the islands. That was most of my intro. There's a lot of other things that I could talk about. This is an amazing, fascinating place, and it has a really rich history of birds and people. But I'm going to jump into your questions so we have time to get through them. So the first question from our viewers is, how many puffin nesting pairs are there on Seal Island? So last year we had about the mid 500s, and I think this year we're probably going to get a little bit higher than that, but we won't know until about July or the beginning of August. And those numbers fluctuate from year to year. I think about 4 or 5 years ago, we reached our all-time peak, which is right near 600, and then we dipped down a little bit after that, and now we seem to be going back up. And those numbers can change based on the sea surface conditions, or really the oceanographic conditions, so how much food is around, what the sea surface temperatures are, things like that. Because sometimes puffins will take a year off from nesting. They don't nest every year, however, most puffins often do. So the point is that number fluctuates from year to year, but we are seeing a general rise on the Seal Island colony. Now I'm going to use this opportunity about the number of nesting pairs of puffins on the island to just talk about the history of these nesting pairs on Seal Island. By the beginning of the 20th century, so the early 1900s, there are almost no puffins, actually no puffins, period, nesting on Seal Island. And that was mainly because of hunters coming in and taking the eggs and killing adults for meat from the 1800s into the 1900s, and also taking feathers for ladies' caps. So unfortunately, the puffins had been extirpated. All the pairs had left, or killed, and they were no longer nesting here. And it wasn't until the early 80s that our boss, Dr. Steve Kress, came up with the idea to reestablish the colony here. So in 1984, they started moving puffin chicks that were about 10 days old from Great Island in Newfoundland. And between 1984 and 1989, they moved about 1,000 puffin chicks, and they raised them here on Seal Island by hand. The human interns were feeding them vitamins and fish, and then they were raising them until they fledged, and the hope was that they would come back to their natal colony, which is what puffins often do. And eventually in 1992, those puffins started nesting on the island through the use of social attraction, which is the use of audio recordings, fake puffin decoys, and mirrors. And the mirrors were really unique. They were just kind of these boxes that the puffins could look into, and they would think that there was a real puffin there. So the idea was to simulate that there was a thriving puffin colony. And what we were able to do was attract puffins from all around, some of which were the ones that were hand-reared by the interns on the island in the 80s, and start the puffin colony. And since then, from 1992, we went from only having a handful of pairs all the way up to nearly 600 today. So our next question here is, can you talk about where these puffins on Seal Island come from, which I just talked about, and how much longer will they be on the island? So our puffins typically arrive from their wintering grounds between probably near the end of April maybe a little bit earlier, some of them, but they really don't start making landfall until the end of April, beginning of May. Once they start making landfall, it takes about 2 to 3 weeks for them to clean up their burrow and find their mate and lay their egg. And once that happens, it's going to take them about another 40 to 45 days to incubate that egg. And then once the egg hatches, it's going to take them an additional 40 to 50 days to raise that chick. Once that chick fledges, the parents might hang around the island a little bit. They will not accompany that chick to sea, but they will stay to defend their burrow from other puffins that may be prospecting a burrow for future nesting season. But typically, most of our puffins are gone by the beginning of September. Some stragglers may stay until the beginning or the middle of September, but not many. So what we know from some of the tracking data that we have on our puffins is that some of our puffins are actually going up to the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada. So actually flying north once they leave Sail Island in September and October, but not all of them. There is some variability. They might stay up there for a month or two before coming back south, and most of our puffins are wintering off the seamounts and canyons in very pelagic waters about 200 to 300 miles off of New York and New Jersey. And we think that most of them are likely solitary birds just spending the winter by themselves out on the deep sea. And again, they won't return here until about April. So our next question is one that I'm really excited to talk about, and this is the viewer was curious if razorbills were nesting on Seal Island, and if so, how many pairs? And they had seen them quite frequently this year on the Loafing Ledge camera. So for those of you that aren't too familiar with razorbills, you might have seen them on the webcam this year. They have a white belly and a black back. They're slightly bigger than the puffins. They have a thinner bill and a nice white line across the end of the bill, a nice kind of ring. Now those razorbills, they didn't start nesting on Seal Island until about the mid-2000s, maybe a little bit earlier. We didn't have too many pairs back then. Last year, we had about 36 pairs on the island, and that was our all-time high. This year, we've been seeing many more razorbills around the island. Our high counts last year of razorbills at a single time were around 100 individuals, and this year we've gotten almost 200 at a single time. So I'm expecting that we probably will see over 40 pairs this year, if not close to 50 pairs of razorbills, and that number is continuing to grow every year, and we're pretty happy about that. Now, most of the razorbills on the island are actually not nesting where the majority of puffins are nesting. Where the puffin colony is on the northeastern point of the island, or head as we call it, we probably have about 10 pairs of razorbills. The rest of the razorbills, where I think about 30 to 40 pairs are nesting, are down on the western head, the western point of the island, where kind of near where the cormorants are nesting is there, and there is some puffins down there as well. It's a bit confusing. If you go to the Project Puffin website and follow the links to Seal Island, you actually can download one of the maps of the island, and you can see where some of the nests are laid out. It's a really neat thing to do, and perhaps we can share that link to Facebook after the chat. So our next question here is, what connection do these puffins have with the ones currently on the Shetland Islands in the UK? And are they the exact same puffins? Do those puffins in Shetland keep to Europe, and do the Seal Island puffins stay to the Americas, or do they cross the Atlantic? So this is a really interesting question. The first thing that I'll say is that all puffins pretty much in the Atlantic are indeed Atlantic puffins, and they are the same species. However, there isn't too much crossbreeding, so the birds from the Gulf of Maine are not going up to the UK with any regularity. There are a few records of birds crossing the Atlantic, but it is relatively rare. It really does not happen often. So their breeding areas and their wintering areas are very distinct, and they really do not overlap that much. So our next question is, have we noticed any hatched pufflings yet? Not yet, but the earliest egg that we found laid was, the first check that we did for puffin eggs was May 10th, and we had an egg that day. So I suspect that our first puffin chick will likely be between today and maybe June 25th at the latest. So we're keeping our eye out for them, and I think this afternoon you may see us crawling around the rocks, checking inside of some of our puffin burrows that we check every 5 to 7 days to keep track of those puffins throughout the summer. So we will be looking, and I will let you guys know as soon as we have our first puffling hatched. Our next question here is 2 to 3 years ago, there was a different pair of puffins using the burrow cam nest. Are they back in a different nest, and are the nests first come? So that's the first part. There's a kind of a twofold question. Um, so the puffin pair, Finn and Phoebe, if everybody recalls that puffin pair before Billy and Willie, um, they have moved on. I think something must have happened, and Finn did not come back. Last year, I saw Phoebe nesting with an unbanded puffin, only about 2 to 3 burrows away from the burrow cam nest number 59. I have seen Phoebe this year, but it's hard to confirm that she's nesting or not until we either see her on the nest, which is very difficult to do with where she's nesting, or until we see her carrying fish, which is a sure sign that she indeed has a chick. So once chicks start hatching and we see her carrying fish, hopefully we can confirm that she's nesting again. And once we know she's in the same burrow, we can see if she's mating again with that unbanded puffin, or maybe she's found Finn again. But that's pretty unlikely. She's probably going to stick with that other puffin from now on. The next part of this question was, are the nests first come, first serve? And I do not think that this is I don't think that that's the case. I think most puffins will nest in the same burrow from year to year. They defend those burrows when they get back, and they will fight the nest in that burrow over and over again. However, on occasion, some puffins do lose their burrow in a fight to another pair, and another pair will take that nest over. So in that way, they are kind of first come, but once a puffin becomes established in a burrow, they like to stay there. The next part of this question was, once the baby puffins return to nest after about 3 years, does that mean the new nests are being built to accommodate the growing population, or is the survival rate so low that the amount of nest remains steady? So what we are seeing is we are finding new burrows every single year. So it's not just the same burrows that are being used from year to year. They are expanding. There's plenty of habitat on Seal Island, so there's plenty of room to grow and to have new burrows. And we've already found several new puffin burrows this year. And I expect that we will find many more. And the known number of puffin, I think this year actually, we might cross 800 known puffin burrows on the island. But that by no means that every single burrow out of those 800 is being used in a single year. Some puffin burrows are only used for the life of the puffins, and then they're lost. And sometimes for many years, a puffin may not use that burrow, even though it was nested in before. And the comment about survival rate, we don't think the survival rate is very low. We still see, we do think that the survival rate is declining, but not to the extent that the population is drastically declining. In fact, we're still increasing. Our next question here is it true that puffins lose the color on their beaks when the breeding is over? Yes, it is true that the bright fluorescent kind of orange and yellow and blue colors will subdue to a bit of a darker bill in the winter. And in addition to that, the white around their face will actually turn to a bit of a darker color, and their bill will shrink in size a little bit. So yes, that is true. Our next question here is, do Billy and Willie mate for life? How do they know to come back to their nest? And is it the same location as it was last year? So it's hard to say that we may see Billy and Willie mate for life. If one of the two did not come back to the island to breed, then it is likely that they will find another mate and they will breed again. So we have recorded that happening. But as long as the two survive and they both come back to the island again, they will likely mate together year after year, as long as they both come back. I'm not exactly sure, and I don't think anybody is exactly sure how they know to come back to their nest. But this knowledge must be kind of learned or a very innate trait early on in their life history, because what we do see with puffin chicks is that the puffin chicks will return usually to their natal colony or islands very close to where they were born. So from very early on in their life, they have some sort of navigational map built into their mind to find where they're going to nest and settle in. But we're not clear on exactly how they find their exact nest and how they find their mate from year to year. Our next question is, would Conrad, who was the Puffin burrow cam chick last summer, come back to the Loafing Ledge to start a family? So it is very likely that Conrad will come back. He was a very healthy chick, so as long as he did well this winter, there's a good chance that he will come back. Typically, we don't see too many Puffins come back as 2-year-olds. It's most likely that we'll probably see him next summer, in the summer of 2019. But we do think that he'll come back. And kind of a spin-off of this is that Pal, who was the Puffin chick back in 2014, was last seen last summer, so it was his 3rd year of life. And he was seen at the very end of the summer, which is pretty typical for young Puffins. Often the 3- and 4-year-old Puffins that aren't breeding in a given year will often come to the island in July and August and start looking for mates and potential burrows to nest in. So we're hoping that that Pal will start breeding either this summer or the following summer. However, based off of the observations that I've made of Pal this summer, it does seem that he is courting multiple Puffins. It's not just a single Puffin. I've seen him with banded Puffins and unbanded Puffins. So I think he's still looking for a mate, and he probably won't be breeding this summer. Our next question here is, what kinds of fish are the Puffins bringing in for their pufflings so far this season? Unfortunately, we don't have any pufflings yet. But once we start seeing fish coming in, hopefully we can share some photos, maybe over Facebook or a blog post, of all the different fish species that they're bringing in. So stay tuned on that question. So the next question is going back to Pal the Puffin. It says, in your sightings of Pal, does his behavior suggest a prospective partner or any burrow prospecting? So I have seen Pal multiple times, as I was just saying, and most of his activity so far seems to be around the boulder berm, which is really interesting since that's where his natal burrow was, number 59, in the boulder berm. So he has been closer to the camera than burrow 59, and he's been kind of going in and out of the rocks. It doesn't seem like he's mating. It seems like he's courting multiple birds right now. And I should say that we still do not know if Pal was a female or a male, so we'll have to stay tuned on that as well. What other species besides the Puffins are nesting at this location? I've seen Razorbills, a common murre, and of course all those terns. So I'll quickly run through all the species that are nesting on Seal Island again. We have the Atlantic Puffins, of course, both common and Arctic terns, which you'll see on all the cameras occasionally. Razorbills, the common murre. We also have common eider, one of our sea ducks here. Both the double-crested and great cormorants, which I was talking about, the great black-backed gull, herring gull, and Leach's storm petrels are also nesting on the island. The Leach's storm petrel you won't see during the day, but they do return to the island at night. They're a small bird. Some people, when they first come to the island, sometimes mistake them with bats. They're about that size. And they come to the island at night because they're very vulnerable to predation by blackback and herring gulls during the day. But they're burrowing into the sod, digging underground all around the areas where we have grass and things like that where they can really burrow into. And we think that there's probably over 1,000 pairs, but we're still learning more about them. We're starting a project. We started it last summer and continuing it this year to put those metal bands on storm petrel legs to try to get a better idea of how many there are. But with the storm petrels, because they only come back at night, we're often up late banding those storm petrels well into the night. And we usually run our nets to catch the birds between 9:30 and 12:30 or 1 in the morning to catch those guys. And in addition to all those seabirds that we have nesting here, we also do have some songbirds. We have song sparrows and savanna sparrows, and some common yellowthroats that nest on the island, mainly in the grassy, kind of shrubby areas that are on the island. So our next question here is that it appears that there are many more puffins on the Loafing Ledge than in previous years. Is this a good indication of good success for the fledglings in 2014 and 2015? So we are seeing quite a few birds from 2014 around, and some from 2015, though not too many. So it is a bit, it's probably suggests that there was some really good success of those fledglings in those years, but it also has to do with a lot of the conditions that are around the island, which are conducive for loafing. We don't totally understand what is a good day for loafing puffins. However, we do know on a day like today, where it's very beautiful, the seas are relatively calm, that puffins seem to not like to loaf too much, and we don't really know why. Puffins' favorite days to loaf are really windy, rough sea days, maybe a rainy day, um, but a day you might not want to be loafing on the water around the island. Um, so that's when we tend to see more puffins. And we have had quite a few stormy days this year, so that could be one reason. And the other thing that we suspect with loafing puffin numbers is that it could be related to local food supply. So just like the puffin chicks, the adult puffins have to find food and feed themselves, of course. Um, so if there's a lot of food close by, then we are theorizing that there would be more puffins loafing because they don't have to spend as much time and energy searching for food, and they can spend more time at the colony. So our next question is, why was the dummy puffin put on the rocks? So the dummy puffin, or the decoy as we call it, um, goes back to that story that I was mentioning about the reestablishment of the puffin colony here on Seal Island. So that decoy is just kind of a remnant of that project where we were attracting the puffins to come back to Seal Island and to start nesting here after they had been pushed off of the island by humans. Um, and we still put those decoys up occasionally. We want to. The puffins are always very curious creatures. When they're on the loafing ledge and they see that puffin, they get curious. They want to go see it. So we put it there in front of the camera to encourage puffins to land near there. Um, but they do not serve the same purpose as they did back in the 80s and 90s when we were trying to reestablish the colony and attract the puffins to come back to the island. Our next question here is, would it be possible to share online a basic database with the ID info for puffins whose band numbers we see on the loafing ledge? This is something that I would love to do. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Um, there's a lot of bands out there. I think the easiest thing to do would to be we need some sort of database where you guys can put in your info, and then we can easily share it with us and get it into our database. And then at the end of the year, we can share all the results. Um, there literally is thousands and thousands of puffins in our database, so there's a lot of numbers, and it would take a lot of work to move everything over into a user-friendly database so that you guys could get your band numbers into that you're seeing at the loafing ledge. Because in addition to Seal Island, we also have birds that are coming to Seal Island from the nearby Project Puffin Island Matinicus Rock, which is only 8 miles away, and they have a puffin colony of well over 500 pairs, if not over 600 pairs of puffins. Eastern Egg Rock to the south of us, which has nearly 200 pairs of puffins. And then there's another island to the north of us called Petit-Manan Island with a little less than 100 pairs of puffins. And then up to the north of us, up at the mouth of the Bay of Fundy, is an island called Machias Seal Island, not to be confused with this seal island. And they have the biggest puffin colony in the Gulf of Maine with around 5,000 pairs. So that's a very large puffin colony. And we do see some intermingling, and every year we see puffins from Matinicus Rock, from Eastern Egg Rock, and from Machias Seal and Petit-Manan, and they're all kind of moving around. And when we've been banding them year after year after year, there's just thousands of bands, and it can get confusing really quickly. But I agree that this is something we need to work on so we can get in all your resighting info because it is really valuable information to us. We just need a better way to store all this awesome data that you guys are collecting for us. So our next question from the viewers is, do puffins have eyelids, or do they have just very dark eyelids? So the puffins do have eyelids. They're a bit different than ours. There is kind of two layers to the eyelid for the puffins, which allows them to see while they're swimming, but they also, you'll see them when they get kind of sleepy, they'll blink or they'll close their eyes, so you can kind of get a good look at them when you're on the island. I don't know how well you could see it in the camera, but they're actually not super dark eyelids. The first layer is a bit clear, and then the second layer is it's almost a whitish color when they close their eyes. And in addition to that, there is some variation in their eye color, actually. Some puffins have very light, kind of blue eyes, and some are a bit darker. And I'm not sure if that changes with age or if it's just individual variation, but I have been noticing that more and more the more I look at puffins. Our next question here is, how are the fish this year? Will there be ample source of fish for the small little puffins? And again, it's unfortunately a bit too early for us to tell anything about the fish. I will say that the fish species that we're seeing around the island, often the terns, so the common and Arctic terns, when they're courting their mates and they're getting ready to nest and they're laying eggs, they'll often bring a fish to court a female, the male will, and then once that female or the male is incubating the eggs, the pair will often switch off fish and feed each other. So we do see quite a bit of fish that way. And what we have been seeing this year is a kind of the typical mix of fish that we are used to seeing out here. So hake, some herring. That's probably the least common this year. Hake is by far the most common, pretty much like every other year. Some sand lance. We have seen some butterfish. We do have small amounts of butterfish every year, so it's not a concern yet. But those four species are the most common right now. But we can definitely keep you guys updated on the fish. Our next question is, how are the puffin pair numbers looking this year compared to last year? And are we seeing more or less eggs so far? So, like I was saying earlier, last year we had around in the mid 500s of puffin burrows. It's hard for us to get an exact number, but somewhere near 550, a little more or less than that. And it does seem like there's a lot of puffins around this year, and a lot of the burrows that we do monitor are active, which is good to see. But it's a little too early to tell just how many pairs we have, because they're nesting deep under the rocks and we can't see into all of the burrows. So we have to wait for those parents to fly in and go into the entrance to their burrow. And when they have fish and they're flying into the burrow, we know that they have a chick under there, and we can confirm that there's a nesting pair. So we have to wait for the chicks to start hatching and for the parents to start bringing back fish. And once we see that, we can start to get a better idea of the numbers. Our next question is, have you seen the one-legged puffin up close to see if there's a genetic mutation or possible accident that caused it to lose one leg? So I have seen the one-legged puffin a couple times, but it's really difficult to see the leg that was amputated for whatever reason. So we don't know exactly what happened to it, primarily because the feathers are kind of covering it a little bit. My guess is that there's probably some sort of accident. The puffins are not the most graceful creatures on land, and often I've seen broken legs on puffins after fights. The puffins, especially at the beginning of the year, can be very aggressive to one another when defending their burrows, and they have very strong bills and bites. And when they lock onto each other, it can sometimes end in really a bloody mess. So they can be quite aggressive, and something like that could have happened, or the leg could have got caught in a rock, or there could have been some sort of accident at sea. It's really impossible to tell. But if I get better pictures of it, I would be happy to share them on Facebook or on the Explore chat board. So I can keep an eye out for that bird. I don't see it too often, though. Our next question here is, how long does it take for an egg to hatch? So typically it takes between 40 and 45 days for a puffin egg to hatch. It can depend on the year. Again, we think that it goes back to food supply. So if there's a lot of food around, and a puffin adult can easily feed itself, and they can spend more time on the egg and more time incubating. Another thing that can somewhat affect how much incubation an egg needs is disturbance. Sometimes puffin pairs are disturbed more easily, like if a gull spooks all the terns and they all flush off the island and the puffins leave, that means more time off the egg. But some puffin parents are very good and they stay on that egg. And most of the puffins that we see when we're doing our burrow checks just sit right on the egg the entire time we're watching them, which is really neat to see up close. Our next question is, do we ever see the leech's storm petrel's nests? How far are they from the puffin burrows? So the leech's storm petrel's nests are really all over the island. And if you watch the cam at night on the infrared, you can often see the storm petrels kind of zipping across and going into their burrows. And they are nesting right around where the cameras are and right amongst the terns. It's a little bit hard to hear them, but they have a very distinctive call. They have a purr call that sounds like this. They go, they do that call, and then they also have a flight call that's a bit different. That you'll have to, if you Google leeches, storm petrels, the Cornell All About Birds page will come up, and you can listen to some of those recordings, and then you can move over to the webcam at night once it gets dark, and you can start listening for those leeches, storm petrels calls. They're really neat to hear, but they are really all over where the terns and the puffins are nesting. And I have seen some puffin burrows under rocks where there's both a puffin chick and a leech's storm petrel chick under the same rock. So that does happen on occasion. Our next question here is, how do the puffins react and behave around humans? So this is a really interesting question. So sometimes, especially on a clear day like this, it's very difficult to approach puffins that are loafing on the rocks. They often flush very quickly, and they don't like to hang out on the rocks or be around people. However, when we have those dark and kind of stormy, rainy days, sometimes you can walk within 10 feet of puffins without them flushing. A lot of the puffins around Seal Island and islands where there's full-time interns working on the island during the summer, they're quite a bit more accustomed to people. And sometimes we can be in the bird blinds, and they'll often walk within feet of you while you're in the bird blind, and they can probably see us. But it's kind of our own little territory that we've established within the tern and puffin colony. And once we're into our territory, meaning the bird blind, we're kind of accepted there, and the puffins will approach us a bit more closely. When we're looking inside the puffin nests, when we're really climbing around the rocks and we're going under the rocks to see if we can see the chicks and the eggs, the puffins behave a bit different. Often, the puffins, as I was saying, just sit right on their eggs, and they'll just stare at you when you're looking at them. And other times, some individuals may just kind of turn their head and go to the back of the burrow and hide in the corner, and then return right back to their egg. And very rarely the puffins will flush off the eggs when you approach them over the rocks, or you're looking into their burrow. So it's a bit variable. It depends on the weather, and it depends on the puffin individual themselves. So the preseason reports of warm sea surface temperatures were troubling. Have they improved since you've been on the island? So the sea surface temperature problems are an interesting conundrum here. What has basically happened in the Gulf of Maine is the Gulf Stream kind of skirts up the coast of, shoots off of North Carolina and Hatteras, and then shoots up to the east, up towards the UK and Iceland. But occasionally there's these you can almost think of them as like ocean storms in a way, like that are just happening on the surface and then down to deep water. And they're basically just swirls of water that spin off the Gulf Stream. And what they often do is they hit right into the continental shelf off of the northeastern, the northeastern part of the United States. They often just kind of dissipate there. However, this year what happened with the warm water is we had one of these spin-offs of warm water, which are called a warm core ring, that hit one of the channels of water that enters the Gulf of Maine along the continental shelf. And that allowed the warm water that was actually quite deep to come into the Gulf of Maine and raise some of the bottom temperatures in the Gulf of Maine. However, that it's really unclear how that warm water will kind of spread out in the Gulf of Maine, but we do need to pay attention to it because that's pretty similar situation to what happened in 2012, and 2012 was a really bad year for puffins, as was 2013. And that was one of the warmest years that we've had in the Gulf of Maine. Um, so when we first got to the island, the sea surface temperatures around the island proper were a bit warmer than usual, maybe about 2 degrees, maybe three. But those sea surface temperatures haven't been raising as quickly as I thought they might. So at least around the island, the sea surface temperatures now have kind of averaged out, and they're not too warm. So I'm not too worried about it. There seems to be a lot of food around. I've heard some reports of minke whales from around the island, which isn't too typical. But I don't think that has anything to do with warm water. But it could suggest that there's more food around. We're also seeing more harbor seals, um, a lot of other more unusual seabirds that are around the island and foraging. Um, so hopefully that's a good sign that there's plenty of food and that the warm sea surface temperatures that came in to the Gulf of Maine in the early spring won't be affecting the puffins too much. But only time will tell. And luckily we have interns, and there's lots of people that are donating money to keep the interns out on the island. And we can continue to do this work to monitor the puffins and how they're responding to warming sea surface temperatures. So our next question here is, why do we see one of the guillemot chicks kill the other nearly every year? So the guillemot chicks are an interesting species. So the guillemot chicks, unlike the puffins, have 2 eggs in most years. And some years when there's not enough food, or if the A chick, the first chick that hatched, takes too much of the food and the B chick doesn't get enough, then the B chick can often die. Um, and it's very variable with the guillemots. In 2016, which was a very poor year for our puffins, um, in general, we had very low nesting success, um, and a lot of puffins were starving. Uh, we did have a lot of guillemot chicks have the second chick die. But last year we had a lot of guillemot nests that successfully raised 2 chicks. So it's variable from year to year. It does seem like the parents of the burrow cam that we have for the guillemots, perhaps they're just not as good at catching fish for 2 chicks, and can only raise one. There is a lot of individual variation between the parents, and it isn't necessarily clear cut. We do have one burrow that we monitor every year of the black guillemot that has raised 2 chicks for the last 4 years. Um, so there is a lot of variation, and it really just comes down to how much food can the second chick that hatches gets. Our next question here is, what predators threaten puffins? So there's a lot of different predators that we get worried about with puffins. Because we're about 20 miles off of the mainland, we're not terribly worried about getting mammalian predators. Um, However, on eastern Egg Rock, which is a bit closer to the mainland, they have had an otter before. An otter could really decimate an entire puffin colony if it went through and ate all the eggs and chicks and even adults. Um, so, really, otters and minks are a big concern. Really, any aquatic mammal getting onto the island and eating eggs or chicks would be a really bad thing for puffins. But we primarily worry about avian predators out here on Seal Island. Bald eagles can be very disruptive to puffins. They're not great at catching puffins. The puffins are probably a little bit too quick for them. Once they get on the water, the puffins can easily dive and evade them, or they can go under the rocks and hide from them. Peregrine falcons occasionally will catch puffins, but really not too often. So those are the big ones. Our biggest concern would be having a mammal on the island, but that has not happened, and we haven't lost any eggs or chicks to mammals on Seal Island yet. Our next question here is, when do the chicks get their beautiful bill coloring? So that coloring will gradually build through the chick's life. Usually when they're a 2-year-old, it usually stays pretty dark and dusky in their first summer, a full summer of life. When they are 3 years old, their bill will get a little bit more color, and by 4 years old, their bill will almost look like an adult. Sometimes it's a bit smaller, and it can be noticeable when you're in a bird blind and you're up close with that puffin. So it kind of builds, but usually by 3 or 4 years old, you see most of those colors come in. But it's not until 5 that they typically have their full-sized bill. and you can really see all those beautiful colors. All right, so we're running out of questions here, but oh, for now, if you guys have any more questions, please just comment on the explore.org chat board on any of the cameras. And if you can tag me, I believe my name on Explore is Keenan Project Puffin or something like that. You can look at my other comments for that. But if you tag me, then it's much easier for me to see all the questions that you guys are asking. And I'm happy to ask them. But when they get buried in amongst all the comments, it can be difficult to tear through them and find the questions. So please tag me if possible. I was really happy to do this live chat today, and hopefully we'll be joining you again soon. It sounds like there's going to be a live chat coming up in July, the beginning of July, with Dr. Steve Kress, my boss, and he'll be able to answer all sorts of puffin questions for you, and he can tell you more about the history of the island, and I may be joining him as well. So thank you all so much for this live chat, and keep watching the Burrow Cam, and hopefully we'll have a chick within the next week or two. Alrighty, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.